Today, we will be talking about the mites. Mites are short creatures. They have about 3 to 4 foot height on average. They're medium-lived. They have this soft yet short fur that covers most of their body. Their faces terminate in a sort of a long snout kind of a thing, which clamps down a little bit with some nice incisors in there. And they have the color of their fur can vary wildly. Most mites actually like to dye their fur in one direction or another. The mites also have long, multi-digited fingers. Their hands are about the normal size, but for example, a mite, who again, I remind you, is literally half my height, would have a finger about this long, if you can see this, relatively speaking here. And that finger has multiple knuckles on it, so it's very dexterous and can actually flex both ways. Their fingers can go this way as well as this way. They are well known for being expert builders, expert designers, and for being the species that managed to reverse engineer the hub sufficiently enough to actually get it working. Something they have kept very quiet to this day. The mites, when I say the mites, I am speaking in a generalized sense, of course. There is no real mite organization, but this is true. This is admittedly true with most species, but I tend to say the mites more often because there is kind of a cooperation of several mites. That cooperation is specifically the group that actually operates and runs the hub. That group also has significant ties to the Republic, which makes sense because the Osteth Republic is home to the mites. The vast majority of mites live there in the Osteth. The fact that they can survive so well in that nightmare zone probably says something about it. Of course, they also have the Lugians and the gnomes down there, so it's not like they're alone. But yeah, they're really good at the technological and magical innovation. They are very, very skilled at weaving in general and tend to be fairly intelligent. Are you kidding me? I've just been having problem after problem. This is like my third day solid of recording, and apparently the sun is going to be my enemy today. Whatever. Ignore the sun up there. I don't feel like waiting like an hour, and then I won't have the ability to record anymore just because people will be here and making noise. So I'm sorry about the sun, okay? The mites in general have this social bias against, for lack of a better way to put it, biological imperatives. They don't like the very concept of the reproductive cycle. To them, it's disgusting, unnecessary, and frankly, kind of inefficient. This manifests in several ways. First of all, in the last several years, several decades really, there has become this social stigma and kind of a societal, cultural leaning against the very idea of mites becoming friends with other mites. I'll describe more about what that means in a moment. It also has to do with how the mites view blood relationships. That is to say, basically not at all. Most mites can't even say who their parents are, or who their children are, or anything like that. They literally lack the ability because of the fact that they don't know. They don't keep track of that sort of thing. Now, it is worth noting that mites tend to reach a level of relative maturity in terms of physical and mental needs at about age 5. That's the equivalent of a human real-life terms of about age 18. So mites are taken care of for the first 5 or so years of their life, sometimes younger, sometimes like 4 years, and then they're left to their own devices. It is also sort of expected of a mite that you are ready to go, that you are someone who is prepared to get out there and block the sun with your face, prepared to get out there and live your own life by age 5. You know, that's like the deadline, right? It's similar to how here in the States you're basically expected to be ready for and already getting into college by age 18. You know, it's a similar concept, at least for several places I've lived at. Now, the other interesting thing about mites, though, with regard to this blood relation thing, is mites don't really believe in the concept of prejudice. This kind of ties into this. Let me rewind a little bit. To a mite, the idea of being connected to someone for no other reason than the fact that there is a blood relation between them just seems silly. As an aside, yes, I am talking generally. There are probably outliers out there. I have not come up with any myself, but this is just the generalized perspective. So, to a mite, the idea of I have to be close to you just because you gave birth to me doesn't even begin to make sense to them. There's no actual thing there, right? Part of that is because the mites themselves believe in actions. This is how it ties into the lack of prejudice thing. To a mite, just like being born by someone is not a big deal, encountering someone else who is a Lugian, or someone who is poor on the street, or someone who's a mercenary or whatever, the idea of prejudging someone, which is what prejudice means, does not make sense to them. Rather, you, the individual, have to prove or otherwise show who and what you are based on your actions, specifically based on how it is you act. And that has to be over a long period of time. This can be seen as a negative because mites will not perceive certain types of individuals as threats, even though they even though they probably should under certain circumstances, but they won't, because they don't know this person. They have to prove themselves through their actions. This ties back into that friend thing I mentioned earlier. To be considered a friend by a mite is basically one of the biggest and most amazing, the biggest honor that a mite can give is calling you their friend. They don't use that word lightly. See, to become a friend of a mite, you have to have spent years proving yourself to them through actions. But if you've done so, that mite is basically going to be your friend, in a real sense of the word, through thick and thin. Now, yes, there are ways to bypass that, under extreme circumstances, like if you try to attack them or you go murderous or whatever. But it is worth noting it takes that kind of extreme for a mite to rescind that friendship. If you have a big problem, or if you have some problem with the locals, or some other kind of difficulty, they'll stick through you. They'll stick with you through that. They will help you through that. They won't stick through you, I swear. They are your friend. They are your ally, and they will assist you in every way they can. So again, having a mite's friendship is not only very useful, but the kind of thing that is considered very, very... It's a big honor. And again, amongst the mites, there's actually a ceremony for giving someone friendship. And it usually involves a party. How the ceremony actually is undertaken varies wildly. There's certain words that need to be said, and a couple of actions that need to be taken, which culminates in a hug, of all things. However, the specifics of how that works vary because they don't care. As long as it's something that's specific to the moment, they're down with it. Oh, jeez. There we go. Blocking the sun with my face. The other thing about mites, though... I mentioned earlier that a mite will not even be aware of who their blood family is. For all intents and purposes, when other species say my family, what mites usually... the mite term for family is these friends. These are the people that they will be with through and through. Now, remember I mentioned that dislike of the biological imperative of reproduction? It literally just occurred to me this second that's very a Vulcan mindset, isn't it? That has kind of made this stigma against becoming friends with other mites. Because, and again, there's nothing really wrong with it, and it's not like you will be judged for it, but there is just this sort of social stigma against becoming friends with another mite, because those kind of friendships will lead towards close relationships, and that might lead to you actually having children with that mite, and that would be terrible. I don't remember if I've mentioned this or not. This is my third time trying to record this, but the mites also... they've been trying to find a way to bypass the biological imperative. Either a new method of birthing children, or simply making it so they stop aging. They've been researching many, many, many options in order to basically stop the reproductive cycle, for mites specifically, for decades. Actually, close to a century now has been spent working on this. I suppose I can't actually tell you how successful they've been, because none of the party knows, and nobody knows in character, but suffice it to say that they've been more successful than you'd think, and it's debatable if that's a good thing or not. Now, I mentioned the mite's dexterity and capability, those fingers, and their general keen intellect. Part of that is manifested in... well, okay, part of that was bred into them. The mites originally were already inclined towards that. When the scions found the mites, they were like, wow, these guys are amazing. And they kind of did this short-term reweaving breeding program in order to try and encourage that kind of through selective breeding, those kind of traits in the mites. Now, whether that succeeded or not is debatable, because, again, the scions were only in power for 14 years, I want to say. An extremely short period of time. But the scions had been using the mites as a builder force. Now, this is the thing that I want to mention, because this really speaks highly of how the scions think. They didn't use the mites to invent things, because they're a lesser race, they're not going to invent anything. They didn't use them as engineers, they used them as builders, basic workers. The Lugians and the mites actually worked together under Scion control. The Lugians handled the big stuff, the mites handled the small stuff, and from a Scion perspective that makes perfect sense. Both of them are being useful, both of them are working towards what it is that their species works best for, and it's benefiting the Scions, which is awesome. After all, anything that benefits the Scions benefits everyone else, right? Now, I mentioned earlier the mites have no clans. This was a deliberate choice on behalf of the mites back when the clans were established, right around the year 0. Actually, more closer to like the year 4 or 5, but whatever. Point being, when the clans were actually established, the mites as a whole said, well, that doesn't make any sense. And that's like exactly how they said it. That doesn't make any sense. Why would we identify with something based solely on our birth? That's kind of the origination of this whole mindset, culturally speaking, in a nutshell. It is a thing that has been debated as to whether or not that cultural mindset is something that's true of the mites, like part of their species, or if it is purely a cultural thing that was started by those first few mites. Because there's two ways to think of this. Either all mites are inclined towards thinking this way, like it happens in most fiction. Most species have a certain type of hat. Or the initial mites thought that way, and because they were the ones who were basically founding mite society, mites thereafter were taught these same values and given these same perspectives, and therefore it became a part of the mite society and culture. No one's entirely sure of which is actually the truth or not. Let's see, I talked about the clanless thing. There's one other tidbit amongst mites. It is usually actually really difficult for most species to discern one mite from another, because the differences between them are minute. They exist, but they're small. Leading to the often said joke, it's just a mite, I can't tell one from the other, right? But regardless of that problem, this actually leads to another little difficulty, because mites don't have clans, and clans are used as a primary identifier. So oftentimes a mite will actually go out of its way to make a secondary identifier just to make themselves more distinct, so you can determine which mite is which. And I don't mean like another name. I mean literally on their clothing they'll wear a freaking name tag that says I am, Johannesson number 3 or something like that, or I am Terafus number 5 or something along those lines, so that you can more clearly identify which mite is which. And the funny thing is, the mites don't have any problem with that, at least in general, of course, outliers, etc. But the mites find that to be simply efficient. It's a good way of helping other species to determine which is which, and especially on the workforce, like for example, if they're working on a new airship, it's really helpful to know exactly which mite is which in order to make sure that all the work is being done in the proper order. I think that's all I got for mites. Hope you've enjoyed, as usual. Any comments, questions, both about the mites or about Primus as a whole, feel free to put it in the comment section below. See you around, guys. The sun!